Most people think love announces itself with grand gestures, flowers, trips, declarations under fireworks. But that's not how real love speaks. Real love is quiet. It hides in ordinary sentences, tucked between everyday conversations, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. And here's the strange part. Psychologists who study human bonding say that the deepest form of love almost never sounds romantic at all. It sounds simple, almost boring. That's exactly why so many women overlook it. They're waiting for poetry when the truth is arriving in plain language right in front of them every single day. Somewhere between the third date and the third year, something shifts in a man's mind. And if you know what to listen for, you can hear it happening in real time through the words he chooses without even realizing what he's revealing. Today we're going to break down several phrases that only surface when a man has crossed from liking you into truly, deeply loving you. Some of these will surprise you. One of them in particular is so subtle that most women hear it and think nothing of it, when in reality, it's one of the strongest signals of commitment psychology has ever identified. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll never listen to the men in your life the same way again. Let's start with something most people get wrong. Love isn't a feeling that suddenly appears. It's a decision the brain makes after enough evidence has piled up. Neuroscientists who study attachment describe it almost like a courtroom process. The brain gathers data, how you react under stress, how you treat people who can't do anything for you, whether you're the same person in private as you are in public. And once the brain reaches a verdict, the way a person speaks actually changes. Word choice shifts. Sentence structure shifts. The pronouns shift from I to we without anyone consciously deciding to do it. This is why paying attention to language is so powerful. People can fake actions for a while. They can fake gifts, fake dates, fake attention. But language patterns run so deep, so automatically, that faking them long-term is almost impossible. So when a certain phrase starts slipping out consistently, unplanned, almost involuntarily, that's not performance. That's the unconscious mind leaking the truth. The first phrase is deceptively simple. I don't want you to go through that alone. On the surface, it sounds like basic kindness, the sort of thing anyone might say to a friend, a coworker, even an acquaintance going through a hard week. But there's a difference between saying it out of politeness and saying it out of necessity. And if you listen closely, you can hear which one it is. When a man says this and means it on a surface level, it's followed by silence. A kind gesture, then a return to normal life. But when a man says it because something in him genuinely cannot tolerate the thought of you struggling without him nearby, the sentence is followed by action. He rearranges his schedule. He shows up uninvited in the good way, the way that says, I wasn't going to just say something, I was going to actually be there. Psychologists call this proximity-seeking behavior, and it's one of the oldest, most primitive signs of attachment in existence. It's the same instinct you'd see in a parent unable to relax until they know their child made it home safely. It isn't about control. It's about an internal alarm system that goes off the moment you're unprotected and doesn't go quiet until that discomfort is resolved. Here's what makes this phrase so revealing. Most people think declarations of love are about addition, adding compliments, adding gifts, adding grand gestures. But this phrase is about subtraction. It's about a man trying to remove pain from your life before it even fully lands on you. That's not something people do for someone they're casually interested in. That takes a level of emotional investment that develops slowly, quietly, underneath the surface, until one day it just comes out of his mouth almost without permission. But here's where it gets interesting, because there's a version of this phrase that sounds almost identical but means something completely different. And if you can't tell the two apart, you could end up completely misreading someone's intentions. Some men say you're not alone in this as a script, something they picked up because it sounds supportive without any real intention of following through. You can usually tell the difference within a week. Words without follow-up fade into the background of a relationship, forgotten by the person who said them. Words with real weight behind them get repeated in action over and over until they stop being a sentence and start being a pattern of behavior you can set your watch to. I'll come back to how to spot the difference in real time. But first, there's a second phrase one that seems even smaller, even more forgettable than the first. And yet behavioral psychologists consider it one of the strongest indicators of long-term emotional safety a person can offer. Most women hear it and don't think twice. That's the problem. Because if you don't know what you're listening for, you'll miss the moment someone is quietly telling you they see a future with you in it. That second phrase is this: tell me what's actually wrong. Not, are you okay? Almost anyone asks that out of habit, out of social script, expecting the automatic reply of, I'm fine. This is different. This is a direct refusal to accept the surface level answer. It's a small sentence, but it requires something most people are unwilling to give: patience for discomfort. Most people, if they're being honest, don't actually want to hear the complicated answer. They want the easy one. They want, I'm fine, so the conversation can move along comfortably. Sitting with someone else's mess, someone else's overwhelm, someone else's bad day without trying to rush them out of it, that's emotionally expensive. It takes energy. It takes presence. And people generally only spend that kind of energy on those they've decided matter. This connects to something attachment researchers call emotional attunement, the capacity to notice, decode, and respond to another person's internal state, even when they're not explicitly asking for help. Securely attached people tend to develop this skill naturally in relationships they're deeply invested in, because their nervous system becomes wired to your well-being. When you're stressed, something in them registers it, almost like a mirror. That's not something people fake convincingly for long. And it's definitely not something people extend to someone they see as temporary, replaceable, or just for now. You don't build a mirror for someone you're not planning on keeping around. Now, here's where this gets uncomfortable, and I want you to really sit with this for a second, because this is the part almost nobody talks about. If a man has never once asked you what's actually wrong, if every conversation stays on the surface, if your bad days pass by completely unnoticed unless you announce them loudly, that absence is data too. Silence is information. The lack of a pattern is still a pattern. And most women spend months, sometimes years, trying to interpret a man's actions individually instead of looking at what's consistently missing. But we'll come back to that. Because there's a much bigger twist coming, and it has to do with something almost no one expects: the way a man treats you when he has absolutely nothing to gain from being kind. Let's talk about the third phrase, because this one might be the most psychologically loaded of them all. I'm proud of you. It sounds like praise. It sounds simple, even small. But underneath it sits something much more complex, a signal that a person has started measuring their own emotional state based on your wins and losses. Think about it. You don't usually feel pride, a specific layered emotion, about strangers. You don't feel proud of a barista who does their job well, or a coworker who finishes a task on time. Pride requires investment. It requires that your success reflects back onto the person saying it, that they feel personally connected to your outcomes as if they're intertwined with their own. Psychologists who study interdependence in relationships describe this as self-expansion theory. The idea that as people grow closer, they start to psychologically merge parts of their identity with the other person's. Your goals start to feel like his goals. Your growth starts to feel like his growth. And that's exactly why I'm proud of you hits differently depending on who says it. From a stranger, it's meaningless. From a man who has quietly wired his own sense of accomplishment to your progress, it means his brain has started to file you under us instead of you and me. Here's the twist I promised you earlier, the piece almost no one talks about, the detail that separates surface-level attention from actual deep love. It's not about what a man says when things are going well. Anyone can be kind during the easy chapters. Anyone can show up when you're winning, when you're fun, when everything about being around you is effortless. The real test, the one psychologists actually study when predicting relationship longevity, is what a man says and does during your lowest, least impressive, least attractive moments. Not the moments you plan for, not the moments you curate, the moments you can't control. The version of you with no makeup on, exhausted, irritable, crying over something that might not even make sense to anyone else. That version. Because that's the version people abandon when the connection isn't real. And that's exactly the version people stay closest to when it is. Which brings us to the fourth phrase. And I need you to really pay attention here, because this one is almost never said directly. It's usually said in fragments, in half sentences, in moments that don't feel like declarations at all. The phrase is some version of, I like this, just this. Nothing has to be happening. Doing nothing together. Existing in the same space without needing entertainment, without needing a plan, without needing an event to justify the time spent. On paper, this sounds unremarkable. But developmental psychologists who study comfort and attachment point to something called co-regulation, the process by which two nervous systems begin to sync with each other simply through proximity. Heart rates align, breathing patterns shift, stress hormones drop. This isn't poetic language, it's measurable biology. And it only happens consistently between people whose brains have registered each other as safe. This is why a man who is deeply in love doesn't need every moment together to be exciting. In fact, the opposite becomes true. The quiet moments become the ones he values most because they're proof that the relationship isn't performance-based. It's not something that only works when everyone's dressed up and putting their best foot forward. It's something that works in sweatpants, in silence, in the 15th rerun of a show neither of you is really watching. If a person can only tolerate you at your most polished, that's not deep love. That's convenience wearing love's clothing. Real love shows up in the boring, unremarkable, forgettable Tuesday evenings that no one will ever post about. And this is exactly the moment I want to pause and ask you something, because I think it matters more than anything I've said so far. Think about the people who've claimed to love you throughout your life, not just romantically, but in general. Now ask yourself honestly, were they more present during your highlight reel or during your hardest, least impressive chapters? Because the answer to that question tells you more about the truth of that love than any speech, any gift, any grand gesture ever could. Sit with that for a second, and we'll come back to it. Now let's talk about the fifth phrase, because this is the one people misread the most. And once you understand it, you'll start noticing it everywhere, in relationships you've had, relationships you're watching from the outside, maybe even in your own life right now. The phrase is, what do you actually think? Not what do you want to hear, not the version that keeps the peace. The real answer. This might sound small, but it represents something psychologists consider cornerstone of secure, mature attachment. Genuine curiosity about your internal world, even when your opinion might complicate things, even when it might disagree with his. Here's why this matters so much. Early on in most relationships, people tend to present curated versions of themselves. Everyone's on their best behavior. Everyone's avoiding conflict, avoiding friction, trying to keep things smooth. But smoothness isn't intimacy. It's often the opposite. Real closeness requires two full, complicated, sometimes inconvenient people showing up as themselves, disagreements included. A man who has moved into deep love stops needing you to be agreeable. He starts wanting you to be honest, even when honesty is uncomfortable, because somewhere along the way, his priority shifted from keeping this easy to keeping this real. That shift, as subtle as it sounds, is actually one of the most significant markers relationship researchers use to distinguish infatuation from mature, lasting love. Infatuation, by contrast, tends to avoid friction at all costs because infatuation is fragile. It's built on an idealized image, and idealized images shatter easily under the weight of real disagreement. That's why in the early stages of almost every relationship, people are careful, cautious, agreeable. But love that has matured past that fragile stage doesn't need the illusion anymore. It can hold complexity. It can hold two people who see things differently and still choose each other anyway. If a man starts genuinely wanting your unfiltered opinion, not performing interest in it, but actually sitting with it, considering it, sometimes even changing his mind because of it, that's not a small thing. That's one of the clearest signs that he has stopped seeing you as someone to impress and started seeing you as someone to build a real life alongside. There's a sixth phrase worth mentioning here, one that tends to show up later than the others, once a relationship has already had time to settle into something real. It sounds like this. What do you need from me right now? Do you want me to fix it, or do you just want me to listen? This one might be the most psychologically sophisticated of them all because it requires a man to set aside his own instincts. Most people, when someone they care about is upset, default to problem solving. It's an old, deeply wired instinct. See a problem, fix the problem, feel useful. But sometimes fixing isn't what a person needs. Sometimes they just need to be heard, to have their feelings acknowledged without being redirected into a solution. Learning to tell the difference, and more importantly, learning to ask instead of assume, requires a level of emotional maturity that doesn't come naturally to most people. It has to be built, usually through paying close attention to another person over time, noticing what actually helps them versus what just makes the discomfort go away faster for everyone involved. When a man asks this question, it means he has stopped treating your emotional experience as a problem to be managed and started treating it as something worth understanding on its own terms. Now, let's return to something I mentioned earlier because I think it's the most important part of this entire conversation, and it's something almost no one addresses directly. All of these phrases have one thing in common. None of them are loud. None of them are designed to be noticed. None of them come with fanfare, and that's exactly the point. Because here's the truth about human psychology that most people don't want to hear. Attention-seeking love and quiet, consistent love almost never look the same, and people frequently confuse the two. Grand gestures are wonderful, but grand gestures are also easy to perform for someone who isn't deeply invested. A dramatic apology, an expensive gift, a public declaration, these things require money or a single burst of effort, not sustained emotional presence. But the phrases we just walked through require something much harder to fake. Ongoing attention. Day after day, unremarkable moment after unremarkable moment, noticing, showing up, choosing to stay curious about a person instead of assuming you already know everything about them. This is why so many relationships fall apart quietly, without a single dramatic incident. It's not usually one big betrayal that erodes love. It's the slow disappearance of small things. The stop question, what's actually wrong? The stop desire to just sit together doing nothing. The stop curiosity about what you really think. None of these absences feel like a crisis in the moment. They feel like nothing at all, which is exactly why they're so dangerous. People notice betrayal instantly. They rarely notice erosion until they're already standing in the wreckage of it, wondering when things changed, unable to point to a single moment because the change happened in 1,000 tiny withdrawals instead of one dramatic exit. This is worth slowing down on because it explains something a lot of women experience but rarely have language for. That strange, disorienting feeling of nothing is technically wrong, but something feels different. No one lied, no one cheated, no one raised their voice, and yet the warmth has quietly drained out of the room, and no one can quite explain when it happened. Psychologists refer to this general pattern as attachment erosion, and it almost always follows the same sequence. First, the small questions stop. Then the quiet togetherness starts feeling optional instead of essential. Then the curiosity fades, replaced by assumption, a sense of already knowing everything there is to know about the other person, which is one of the most dangerous beliefs two people can develop about each other because it closes the door to actually seeing who someone is becoming, moment to moment, year to year. People change. If the questions stop, the understanding stops keeping pace with the person, and slowly, two people who used to know each other intimately become two people living parallel lives under the same roof, quietly strangers. So here's something worth asking yourself, and I want you to actually sit with this instead of rushing past it in your own life right now. Are these phrases present? Not the grand gestures, the actual quiet ones. The willingness to ask what's really wrong, the comfort in doing absolutely nothing together, the pride that isn't performative, the curiosity about your unfiltered opinion, the instinct to stand close to you during hard moments instead of quietly retreating when things get inconvenient. The willingness to ask what you actually need instead of assuming. If you notice these things consistently, that's not something small. That's one of the strongest psychological indicators of real, lasting, deeply rooted love. Far stronger than any speech or any romantic milestone. And if you're noticing their absence, I want to gently say this. That's not something to panic about immediately, but it is something worth paying attention to. Not every relationship moves at the same pace. Not every person expresses depth the same way. Some people take longer to open up, longer to develop the kind of attunement we've been talking about, longer to let their guard down enough for these phrases to surface naturally. Sometimes it's not about a lack of love at all. It's about a person who never had these things modeled for them, who grew up in a household where feelings weren't discussed, where "how are you" always got a one-word answer and no one pushed further, where quiet togetherness was treated as a waste of time instead of a form of intimacy. People raised in emotionally sparse environments often love just as deeply as anyone else. They simply don't know the vocabulary for expressing it yet. In those cases, growth is possible, but it usually requires patience. And sometimes it requires you naming what you need instead of waiting for someone to guess it. But there's a difference between not yet and not ever. And only time, real time, not performance, not promises, reveals which one you're actually looking at. There's one more thing I want to leave you with because I think it reframes everything we've talked about today. So much of the conversation around love focuses on what we're receiving, what someone says to us, what someone does for us, how someone makes us feel, and that matters absolutely. But there's a mirror to all of this that's just as important, maybe more important. Ask yourself which of these phrases you say. Do you ask people what's actually wrong, or do you accept "I'm fine" because it's easier? Are you comfortable sitting in silence with someone? Or do you need constant activity to feel connected? Do you seek out other people's real opinions? Or do you quietly want agreement dressed up as honesty? Do you ask people what they need? Or do you assume you already know what's best for them? Because love isn't just something that happens to you. It's something you build, brick by brick, phrase by phrase, quiet moment by quiet moment. And the people who experience it most fully are usually the ones who are willing to offer it first, without waiting to be handed permission. Psychology has a name for this. It's sometimes called the reciprocity of vulnerability. The idea that emotional depth in relationships rarely develops in a vacuum, it tends to be co-created. One person softens and it becomes safer for the other to soften too. One person asks a real question and it becomes possible for the other to give a real answer. Depth invites depth, which means if you're waiting for someone else to say these phrases first, you might be missing the opportunity to say them yourself. And in doing so, invite a level of closeness that neither of you has experienced yet. This works both ways, and it's worth remembering that relationships are rarely static. They're living systems, constantly shifting in response to what each person brings into the space. A relationship that feels distant today isn't necessarily doomed to stay that way. Sometimes the shift starts with one person deciding to ask the harder question, to sit in the uncomfortable silence a little longer, to offer the kind of attention they've been waiting to receive. It's also worth saying clearly that none of this is about performing these phrases just to check a box. Saying "I'm proud of you" without meaning, it doesn't create the psychological effect we've been describing. In fact, people are remarkably good at detecting insincerity, even when they can't consciously explain how they know. Tone, timing, follow-through, eye contact, the small details that surround a sentence. All of it gets processed, usually unconsciously, and either confirms or contradicts the words being spoken. This is why trying to say the right things without the underlying emotional investment almost always backfires. It reads as hollow, sometimes even manipulative. The phrases we've talked about today aren't a script to memorize and repeat. They're symptoms. They're what naturally rises to the surface when the underlying emotional structure is already there. Trying to force the symptom without the underlying cause is like trying to fake a fever. It might look convincing for a moment, but it won't hold up under any real scrutiny. And eventually the truth reveals itself anyway. It shows up in the specific way someone says, "Tell me what's actually wrong," instead of letting a bad mood pass by unacknowledged. Think about how easy it would be to just not ask that question. Think about how many relationships, how many friendships, how many family dynamics run entirely on the unspoken agreement to not ask the harder question, to let things slide, to keep things surface level because surface level is comfortable and easy and doesn't require anyone to sit with someone else's pain. Choosing to ask anyway, choosing to interrupt the easy path and take the harder one, that's not a small decision, even if it looks small from the outside. It's a decision made over and over again, so often that it stops looking like a decision at all and starts looking like a personality trait. But underneath it, every single time is a choice to stay present instead of checking out, a choice to be inconvenienced by someone else's bad day instead of politely stepping around it. None of these moments will ever be photographed. Nobody is going to post a picture of a quiet car ride. Nobody is going to caption a kitchen conversation at 11 at night. These moments exist entirely outside of any audience, which is exactly what makes them so revealing. When there's no one watching, when there's nothing to gain from performing, what's left is what's actually true. And according to nearly every serious study on long-term relationship satisfaction, it's these unphotographed, uncaptioned, completely unremarkable moments that predict whether a relationship lasts far more than anything performed for an audience ever could. Researchers who study long married couples, the ones who somehow make it 40, 50 years while still seeming to genuinely like each other, consistently find the same thing when they ask what actually held the relationship together. It's never the wedding. It's never the proposal. It's almost always some version of we just kept talking to each other. Ordinary, unglamorous, and somehow the entire foundation everything else was built on. So before we wrap up, I want to bring everything back together. Because I think when you hear all of these side by side, something clicks into place that might not have been obvious hearing them one at a time. We talked about several phrases today, several quiet signals that psychologists point to again and again when studying what actually separates surface level interest from something built to last, something that survives the version of you that isn't dressed up, isn't performing, isn't trying to be impressive. I don't want you to go through that alone. Proximity seeking, an instinct so old it predates language itself. The same wiring that makes a parent unable to relax until they know their child is safe, redirected now towards someone chosen rather than someone born into their life. It's not about control. It's about an alarm system that only goes quiet once you're no longer facing something difficult by yourself. Tell me what's actually wrong. Emotional attunement, the refusal to accept the easy answer, the willingness to spend energy on discomfort instead of rushing past it. This is the phrase that separates people who care about how you're doing from people who care about how you actually are. Two things that sound identical but rarely feel the same from the inside. I'm proud of you. Self-expansion. A sign that someone's own sense of accomplishment has quietly rewired itself around your outcomes. You don't feel pride for strangers. You feel it for people whose wins somehow became intertwined with your own, whether either of you noticed the moment it happened or not. The quiet comfort of doing absolutely nothing together. Co-regulation. Two nervous systems syncing through nothing more than proximity. Heart rates aligning, stress hormones dropping, safety registering on a level far below conscious thought. This is the one that convenience can't fake because convenience needs excitement to justify itself. Real closeness doesn't. What do you actually think? Genuine curiosity that survives disagreement. The hallmark of a love mature enough to hold two complicated people instead of one curated performance and one quiet audience. This is the phrase that marks the shift from wanting to be agreed with to wanting to be known. And finally, do you want me to fix it, or do you just want me to listen? The willingness to ask instead of assume. Maybe the rarest of everything we discussed today because it requires someone to override their own instincts, to sit with uncertainty about what you need instead of guessing and hoping they guessed right. None of these are loud. None of them are designed to be noticed, which is exactly why so many people miss them entirely, scrolling past the quiet evidence while waiting for something more cinematic to prove what's already been true for a long time. All of them are consistent. All of them are, frankly, and all of them, according to nearly everything psychology has learned about long-term attachment, matter more than any single romantic gesture ever could, because gestures are moments and these are patterns, and patterns are what actually build a life with someone. So here's what I want to leave you with. I want you to actually think about this, not just nod along and scroll to the next video. Of everything we talked about today, which one do you hear the most in your own life right now? And maybe more importantly, which one do you find yourself quietly wishing you heard more often? I want you to type it out in the comments honestly, without softening it, without worrying about how it sounds to anyone else reading. Because I think you're going to be surprised at how many people scroll down after this video and see their own life reflected back at them in someone else's comment. Sometimes the most reassuring thing isn't hearing that you're loved the way you hoped. It's realizing you're not the only one still figuring out whether you are. So go ahead, tell me. I read every single one.